The sun was setting over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Michelle Anderson, a 32-year-old schoolteacher with a warm smile and a heart full of dreams, was driving home after a long day. Her car was filled with grocery bags, fruits, vegetables, and ingredients for her favorite chicken curry recipe. It had been a tiring week at work, but she was looking forward to spending the evening relaxing in her cozy apartment. As she drove down the quiet streets of her neighborhood, Michelle felt a sense of peace. The city buzzed softly around her, with kids playing on sidewalks and neighbors chatting outside their homes. She turned up the volume of her favorite song on the radio, humming along as the gentle rhythm of the music matched the calmness of the evening. Life felt simple, predictable, and safe. But then, out of nowhere, flashing blue and red lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Startled, Michelle checked her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding, and she couldn't think of any reason why a police officer would pull her over. Still, she followed protocol. Slowly, she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, parking her car neatly by the curb. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she waited for the officers to approach. 2 police cars were now parked behind her, their lights still flashing ominously. Michelle's heart began to race. She had been stopped before, too many times to count. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the way the officers took their time getting out of their vehicles, or maybe it was the uneasy silence that hung in the air. Whatever it was, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop. When the 2 officers finally approached her car, they didn't greet her politely like most officers usually did. Instead, they stood on either side of her vehicle, peering into the windows with cold, unsmiling faces. One of them tapped on her window sharply, motioning for her to roll it down. Michelle obeyed immediately, offering a polite, "Good evening, officer," as she lowered the glass. The response she got wasn't what she expected. "License and registration," one of the officers barked, his tone sharp and commanding. There was no warmth in his voice, no hint of courtesy. Michelle nodded quickly, reaching into her glove compartment to retrieve the documents. As she handed them over, the other officer leaned closer to her window, his eyes scanning the interior of her car suspiciously. "You know why we pulled you over?" the first officer asked, his voice dripping with accusation. Michelle shook her head, her voice steady but cautious. "No, sir. I don't think I was speeding." The second officer scoffed loudly, exchanging a glance with his partner. "Yeah, right," he muttered under his breath, though Michelle heard him clearly. His words sent a chill down her spine. She knew that tone all too well. It was the kind of dismissive attitude she'd encountered countless times before. It was the kind of tone reserved for people who looked like her. "Do you have any idea how dangerous it is to drive recklessly?" the first officer continued, raising his voice unnecessarily. Michelle swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. She wanted to explain that she hadn't done anything wrong, but years of experience told her that arguing wouldn't help. Instead, she simply replied, "I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding, but I promise I wasn't driving recklessly." Her polite response only seemed to irritate the officers further. The second one crossed his arms, glaring at her through the window. "You need to learn some respect," he snapped, his words laced with hostility. Michelle blinked in confusion. Respect? For what? All she had done was follow instructions and answer their questions honestly. Why were they treating her like a criminal? As the minutes ticked by, the tension escalated. The first officer began asking invasive questions, demanding to know where she was coming from and why she had so many grocery bags in her car. Each question felt more accusatory than the last, as though they were searching for excuses to justify stopping her. Michelle answered patiently, explaining that she had just finished shopping and was heading home. But her explanations seemed to fall on deaf ears. Then came the moment that froze Michelle's blood. Without warning, the second officer reached for his holster and drew his gun. He pointed it directly at her head through the open window, his finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. Michelle's breath caught in her throat. Her mind went blank, overwhelmed by fear and disbelief. What had she done to deserve this? Why was a loaded weapon being pointed at her face? Keep your hands where I can see them, the officer shouted, his voice loud and menacing. Michelle instinctively raised her hands slightly above the steering wheel, her fingers trembling uncontrollably. Tears welled up in her eyes as she whispered, "Please, please don't shoot me." For what felt like an eternity, the officer kept the gun trained on her, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, the first officer circled her car, opening the passenger door and rifling through her belongings. Groceries spilled onto the ground, apples rolling across the pavement as he tossed items carelessly aside. Passers-by slowed down to watch the scene unfold, some filming videos on their phones. Michelle felt utterly powerless, trapped in a nightmare, with no escape in sight. Every second felt like an hour. Her thoughts raced frantically. Was this really happening? Could these officers hurt her without consequence? Would anyone believe her story if she survived this encounter? The injustice of it all weighed heavily on her chest. Here she was, a law-abiding citizen, a teacher, a daughter, a sister, being treated like a threat simply because of the color of her skin. Despite her fear, a spark of defiance ignited within her. Michelle realized that she couldn't let this moment break her. If she made it out alive, she vowed to fight back, not just for herself, but for everyone else who had faced similar horrors. This wasn't just about her. It was about exposing the ugly truth of systemic racism and holding those responsible accountable. Finally, after what seemed like an endless ordeal, the officers stepped back. They handed Michelle a ticket for a minor traffic violation they couldn't even prove, then walked away without so much as an apology. As Michelle drove off, her hands still shaking, she knew her life would never be the same. Something inside her had shifted. And little did she know the events of that night were about to set off a chain reaction that would change not only her life, but also the lives of countless others. As Michelle drove away from the scene, her mind raced faster than her car. Her heart was still pounding, and her hands trembled on the steering wheel. She glanced at the crumpled ticket in the passenger seat, a piece of paper that felt heavier than it should. The officers had accused her of speeding without evidence, but she knew the real reason they had stopped her. It wasn't about the law. It was about power and prejudice. The tears streaming down her face blurred her vision, but Michelle forced herself to focus on the road. She couldn't afford another confrontation with the police. Every time she passed a patrol car, her stomach tightened, and her grip on the wheel grew tighter. The memory of the gun pointed at her head replayed over and over in her mind like a broken record. She could still hear the officer's voice barking orders, see the cold glint of the weapon aimed directly at her. It was a moment she would never forget, a moment that had stripped her of her dignity and left her feeling utterly powerless. By the time Michelle reached her apartment building, her emotions were a tangled mess of anger, fear, and disbelief. She parked her car and sat there for several minutes trying to steady her breathing. Outside, the city buzzed with life as though nothing unusual had happened. People walked their dogs, laughed on street corners, and hurried home after long days at work. But inside Michelle's world, everything had changed. She finally gathered the strength to step out of her car, grabbing her spilled groceries from the back seat. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, each step felt heavier than the last. Her legs ached not from physical exhaustion but from the weight of what she had endured. When she unlocked her door and stepped inside, she dropped the grocery bags onto the kitchen counter and collapsed onto the couch. For the first time since the incident, she allowed herself to cry freely. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Marcus, her older brother. Marcus lived in Washington, D.C., where he worked as a senior advisor for a prominent senator. He was always busy, but he made it a point to check in with Michelle regularly. Their bond was unbreakable. He had been her rock through every challenge life had thrown her way. "Hey, sis," Marcus said when Michelle answered the call. His deep, reassuring voice instantly brought some comfort. "How's it going?" Michelle hesitated, unsure of how to put her experience into words. How could she explain the terror she had felt? How could she convey the humiliation of being treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of her skin? Taking a shaky breath, she began recounting the events of the evening, the sudden stop, the aggressive questioning, the gun pointed at her head. Her voice cracked as she described the officers' harsh tones and the way they had invaded her personal space. Marcus listened silently, his jaw tightening with each detail. He had heard stories like this before, too many times. But hearing it happened to his own sister hit him like a punch to the gut. When Michelle finished speaking, there was a long pause on the line. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," he said, his voice filled with both sorrow and determination. "But I promise you, we're not letting this slide. These guys need to be held accountable." Michelle appreciated her brother's support, but she couldn't help feeling skeptical. "What can we really do, Marcus?" she asked, her tone heavy with resignation. "This happens all the time. Nobody cares enough to do anything about it." Marcus sighed, knowing his sister wasn't wrong. Systemic racism within law enforcement was a deeply entrenched issue, one that often seemed impossible to dismantle. But Marcus wasn't the type to give up easily. If anyone could make waves, it was him. Over the years, he had built a network of influential contacts thanks to his work in politics. And now, he intended to use those connections to fight for justice. "Listen to me, Michelle," Marcus said firmly. "You're my sister, and I love you. No one gets to treat you, or anyone else, like that. We're going to take this all the way to the top if we have to." Michelle nodded, though Marcus couldn't see her. She trusted her brother completely, but part of her still doubted whether anything meaningful could come of this. Still, she agreed to let him handle things. After hanging up, Marcus wasted no time. He opened his laptop and started drafting an email to a high-ranking official at the Pentagon, a man named General Thompson, whom he had worked with on several projects. They weren't close friends, but they respected each other professionally. In the email, Marcus outlined the details of the incident, attaching photos of Michelle's damaged car and screenshots of social media posts from witnesses who had recorded parts of the ordeal. He emphasized the racial undertones of the encounter and highlighted the urgent need for accountability. Within hours, General Thompson responded, requesting a phone call to discuss the matter further. When Marcus called the general, his tone was calm but firm. "This isn't just about my sister," he explained. "It's about addressing a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for far too long. These officers need to face consequences, not just for what they did to Michelle, but for how they've treated countless others." General Thompson listened intently, nodding even though Marcus couldn't see him. Like many people in positions of authority, he was aware of the growing public outcry against police brutality. This case presented an opportunity to send a message that no one was above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. "I'll look into it personally," the general assured Marcus. "If what you're saying is true, then these men deserve to be investigated thoroughly. You have my word." With that promise, Marcus ended the call, feeling a small sense of relief. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. Meanwhile, Michelle tried to focus on her daily routine, though her mind kept drifting back to that fateful night. She avoided driving whenever possible, opting instead to walk or take public transportation. Each time she saw a police car, her body tensed involuntarily. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the investigation gained momentum. Investigators dug into the backgrounds of the two officers involved, uncovering disturbing patterns of misconduct. Both men had numerous complaints filed against them, many involving allegations of racial profiling and excessive force. Shockingly, none of these cases had resulted in disciplinary action. Instead, the officers had continued serving, emboldened by the lack of accountability. Meanwhile, videos of the incident captured by bystanders began circulating online. One clip in particular showed the second officer pointing his gun at Michelle's head while shouting orders. The footage quickly went viral, sparking outrage across social media platforms. Hashtags like Show Justice for Michelle and Just End Police Brutality trended nationwide, drawing attention from news outlets and activists alike. The public response overwhelmed Michelle. At first, she felt exposed and vulnerable. knowing that millions of people were watching her private trauma play out on screens around the world. But as messages of support poured in, from strangers, colleagues, and even celebrities, she began to feel something else. Hope. For the first time, she realized she wasn't alone. There were others who understood her pain and stood ready to fight alongside her. Encouraged by the growing movement, Michelle decided to speak publicly about her experience. With Marcus's guidance, she gave interviews to major news networks, sharing her story with raw honesty. In one interview, she held up the ticket she had been given that night, a symbol of the injustice she had faced. "I didn't deserve this," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "And neither does anyone else." Her courage inspired others to come forward with their own stories of discrimination at the hands of law enforcement. A mother recounted how officers had handcuffed her teenage son during a traffic stop. A college student described being detained without cause while walking home from class. Each testimony added fuel to the fire, amplifying calls for reform. As I wondered, the pressure mounted. Local authorities found themselves under intense scrutiny. Protesters gathered outside police headquarters, demanding transparency and accountability. Elected officials issued statements condemning the officers' actions and calling for swift action. Even the mayor weighed in, promising that the city would not tolerate racism or abuse of power. For Michelle, seeing the community rally around her was both empowering and humbling. She had entered this ordeal as a victim, but she was emerging as a symbol of resilience and change. Though the scars of that night would never fully heal, she knew she had the strength to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved to live without fear of injustice. Little did she know, the battle was far from over. But with her brother by her side and a nation watching closely, Michelle was ready to face whatever came next. The momentum of Michelle's story continued to grow, fueled by public outrage and relentless advocacy. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags like Justice for Michelle and End Police Brutality, while news outlets kept the case in the spotlight. People from all walks of life, students, parents, teachers, activists, shared their own experiences of discrimination, creating a tidal wave of testimonials that painted a grim picture of systemic racism within law enforcement. Michelle's voice had become a rallying cry for change, but she knew that raising awareness was only half the battle. Real accountability required action, and Marcus was determined to make sure it happened. Back in Washington, D.C., Marcus worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Armed with his network of influential contacts, he strategized ways to ensure the officers involved would face consequences not just locally, but federally. He understood that punishing these two men wasn't enough. What mattered most was dismantling the system that allowed such behavior to persist, unchecked. To achieve this, Marcus needed help from someone with significant power, someone who could push federal agencies into action. That's when he decided to escalate matters further by reaching out directly to General Thompson at the Pentagon. General Thompson, a decorated military leader known for his integrity and commitment to justice, had already expressed interest in the case after Marcus's initial email. When Marcus called him again, he didn't mince words. "Sir," Marcus began, his tone urgent yet respectful, "this isn't just about one incident or two bad cops. This is about exposing a culture of impunity that has thrived for far too long. If we don't act decisively now, nothing will ever change." General Thompson listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. As a veteran of the armed forces, he understood the importance of discipline and accountability. The idea that sworn officers could abuse their authority so blatantly disturbed him deeply. After a brief pause, he responded firmly, "You're right, Marcus, we can't let this slide. I'll mobilize resources to investigate these officers thoroughly. And if they've violated civil rights laws, they'll answer to federal charges, not just local ones." With those words, General Thompson set the gears in motion. Within hours, a team of investigators from the Department of Justice, DOJ, was assigned to the case. Their mandate was clear: dig deep into the backgrounds of officers Ryan Hayes and Derek Cole, the two men responsible for terrorizing Michelle. The DOJ's involvement signaled a major escalation. This was no longer a local issue confined to Chicago's police department. It was now a federal matter, with national implications. As the investigation unfolded, disturbing details began to surface. Records showed that both Hayes and Cole had amassed a staggering number of complaints over the years, many involving allegations of racial profiling, excessive force, and verbal abuse. In one instance, Hayes had been accused of slamming a handcuffed suspect against a wall during an arrest. Witnesses claimed the suspect had done nothing to provoke such aggression, yet the complaint was dismissed without consequence. Similarly, Cole had been flagged multiple times for stopping black drivers under dubious pretenses, often searching their vehicles without probable cause. What shocked investigators the most was how consistently these complaints had been ignored. Internal affairs reviews were either superficial or non-existent, allowing the officers to continue working without repercussions. It was as though the system itself had conspired to protect them, turning a blind eye to their misconduct. For Michelle, learning about this pattern of behavior was both infuriating and heartbreaking. She realized that her encounter hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger problem. Meanwhile, the viral video of the traffic stop continued to circulate online, keeping the pressure on authorities to act swiftly. Viewers around the world watched in horror as Officer Cole pointed his gun at Michelle's head, his posture aggressive and unyielding. The footage became a symbol of everything wrong with policing in America, sparking conversations about race, power, and accountability. Protesters took to the streets in cities across the country, chanting slogans like, "No justice, no peace," and holding up signs bearing Michelle's name. The media played a crucial role in amplifying Michelle's story. Journalists interviewed, legal experts, civil rights advocates, and community leaders, all of whom condemned the officer's actions and called for sweeping reforms. One particularly impactful segment featured a panel discussion on systemic racism in law enforcement. A former police officer turned whistleblower explained how ingrained biases often went unchecked, leading to discriminatory practices. Another panelist, a professor of criminal justice, highlighted the lack of transparency in internal investigations, arguing that departments routinely shielded problematic officers rather than holding them accountable. Amidst the growing scrutiny, Hayes and Cole tried to defend themselves publicly. In a brief statement released through their lawyer, they claimed they had acted in accordance with protocol and denied any wrongdoing. However, their attempts to justify their behavior fell flat. Public opinion had turned sharply against them, and even some of their colleagues distanced themselves from the controversy. Anonymous sources within the police department revealed that Hayes and Cole were widely disliked by fellow officers for their arrogance and reckless behavior. They brought this on themselves, one source told reporters. Behind the scenes, Michelle grappled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt empowered knowing that her courage had sparked a movement. On the other hand, reliving the trauma of that night over and over again took a toll on her mental health. Nightmares plagued her sleep, and she found herself constantly looking over her shoulder whenever she left her apartment. Simple tasks like grocery shopping or walking to work became anxiety-inducing experiences. Despite these challenges, Michelle refused to back down. She leaned on her support system, her brother, friends, and newfound allies to keep moving forward. Marcus remained her steadfast advocate, ensuring she had access to counseling and legal representation. He also helped her navigate the complexities of speaking publicly about such a sensitive topic. Together, they crafted statements that balanced raw emotion with strategic messaging, aiming to inspire action rather than despair. Every interview Michelle gave added another layer to her evolving role as an advocate for justice. She spoke not just as a victim, but as a teacher, a sister, and a member of a community demanding better. As weeks passed, the DOJ's findings began to crystallize. Investigators uncovered damning evidence linking Hayes and Cole to numerous incidents of misconduct. Emails between the officers revealed derogatory language used to describe black individuals, including racist slurs and jokes. Text messages exchanged during shifts included boasts about targeting minority drivers for unwarranted stops. These communications painted a chilling portrait of two men who viewed their badges not as symbols of service, but as tools of oppression. By the time the DOJ presented its findings to federal prosecutors, there was little doubt that Hayes and Cole had violated civil rights laws. The decision to file federal charges against them came swiftly, sending shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide. For many officers, the move served as a stark reminder that accountability applied to everyone, even those wearing uniforms. News of the impending charges reached Michelle late one evening. Marcus called her with the update, his voice brimming with cautious optimism. "It's happening, sis," he said. "They're going to court. This is your victory." Tears welled up in Michelle's eyes as she absorbed the news. Victory? It didn't feel like one. Not yet. Too much damage had been done and the scars ran deep. But for the first time since that fateful night, she allowed herself to imagine a future where justice might prevail, not just for her, but for others who had suffered silently for far too long. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Michelle knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't stop fighting. With her brother by her side and a nation watching closely, she was ready to take the next step toward lasting change. The courtroom was packed to capacity on the day of the trial. Reporters lined the back rows, their cameras clicking incessantly as Michelle Anderson entered the room. She walked slowly, her head held high despite the weight of what she carried. Every eye in the room followed her, some with curiosity, others with admiration, and a few with skepticism. Marcus sat beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. The air buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't just another legal proceeding. It was a reckoning. As the judge called the court to order, the prosecution began laying out its case against officers Ryan Hayes and Derek Cole. They presented evidence that painted a damning picture of two men who had abused their power repeatedly, targeting marginalized communities without fear of consequences. The DOJ's findings were meticulous, leaving no room for doubt about the officers' misconduct. Emails, text messages, body cam footage, and witness testimonies formed a web of proof that exposed not only their actions, but also their mindset. 1. Of the first pieces of evidence shown was the viral video of Michelle's traffic stop. The prosecutor played it on a large screen, pausing at key moments to highlight the aggression displayed by Officer Cole. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor said, pointing to the frozen image of Cole aiming his gun at Michelle's head, "this is not protocol. This is not law enforcement. This is terror." The courtroom fell silent as the gravity of those words sank in. For Michelle, watching the video again felt like reliving the nightmare. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to stay composed. She reminded herself why she was here. Not just for justice, but to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had gone through. Next came the testimony of witnesses who had recorded the incident. One woman, a mother of 3, recounted how she had been walking her dog when she saw the police cars pull over Michelle's vehicle. "I thought they were helping someone," she said, her voice shaking. "But then I saw the way they treated her, the shouting, the gun pointed at her head, and I knew something was terribly wrong." Another witness, a college student named Jamal, described filming the scene because he feared Michelle might be harmed. "It didn't feel safe," he admitted, "and I wanted to make sure there was proof if something bad happened." Each witness added another layer to the story, reinforcing the narrative of systemic abuse. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Michelle herself took the stand. Dressed in a simple navy blue dress, she faced the jury with quiet determination. As she recounted the events of that night, her voice wavered at times, but her message remained clear and unwavering. "I teach children every day," Michelle began, her gaze steady. "I tell them that they can grow up to be anything they want. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, leaders. But how can I say that with honesty when I know that some people will never see me or my students as equals?" That night, those officers didn't see me as a human being. They saw me as a threat because of the color of my skin, and that's unacceptable. Her words struck a chord with everyone in the room. Some jurors nodded sympathetically, while others scribbled notes furiously. Even The defense attorneys seemed uneasy, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. When the prosecutor asked Michelle to describe how the incident had affected her, she paused, gathering her thoughts before responding. "It changed me," she said softly. "I used to trust the police, to believe they were here to protect us. Now I'm afraid every time I see a patrol car, I jump at loud noises. I can't sleep without dreaming about that gun pointed at my face. But more than anything, I feel angry, not just for myself, but for all the people who've been treated this way and never got the chance to speak up." By the time Michelle stepped down from the stand, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Her testimony had humanized the statistics and reports, turning abstract concepts like racial profiling and police brutality into tangible realities. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, holding signs that read, "We believe you, Michelle and justice for all." Social media exploded with reactions as people shared clips of her testimony and praised her bravery. The defense tried to counter the prosecution's arguments, arguing that Hayes and Cole had acted within their rights and that the situation had been misinterpreted. Their lawyer even suggested that Michelle's calm demeanor during the stop indicated she wasn't truly afraid, a claim that drew audible gasps from the gallery. But the damage had already been done. The overwhelming evidence against the officers left little room for doubt. One particularly damning piece of evidence came from an internal affairs investigator who testified about the department's failure to address prior complaints against Hayes and Cole. He revealed that both men had been flagged multiple times for similar behavior, yet nothing had been done to discipline them. "It's a pattern," the investigator explained. "When departments ignore warning signs, they enable bad actors to continue harming the public." By the end of the trial, the jury deliberated for less than a day before returning with a verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in cheers as the judge sentenced Hayes and Cole to prison terms, stripped them of their badges, and banned them from ever working in law enforcement again. For Michelle, the moment was bittersweet. On one hand, she felt vindicated knowing that justice had been served. On the other hand, the scars of that night would always remain. After the verdict, Michelle stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by supporters. Reporters thrust microphones toward her, asking how she felt about the outcome. "Relieved," she said simply. "But this isn't just about me. It's about changing a system that has failed so many people for so long." Marcus stood beside her, beaming with pride. "This is just the beginning," he told the crowd. "We're going to keep fighting until everyone feels safe and respected in their own community." As Michelle looked out at the sea of faces, people of all ages, races, and backgrounds, she felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would still be difficult, but she knew she wasn't alone. Together, they could create a future where no one had to live in fear of those sworn to protect them. And for the first time in months, Michelle allowed herself to believe that real change was possible. The guilty verdict against officers Ryan Hayes and Derek Cole sent shockwaves through the nation. It wasn't just a victory for Michelle Anderson. It was a wake-up call to law enforcement agencies everywhere. For years, cases of police misconduct had been swept under the rug, dismissed as isolated incidents or justified as necessary measures in the line of duty. But this time things were different. The federal charges, coupled with the overwhelming evidence presented during the trial, exposed not just two bad cops, but an entire system that had enabled their behavior. As news of the verdict spread, reactions poured in from all corners of society. Civil rights organizations hailed it as a landmark moment in the fight against systemic racism. "This is proof that accountability is possible," said one activist during a press conference. "But let's be clear, this is only the beginning. We have a long way to go before we can say our justice system truly serves everyone equally." For Michelle, the aftermath of the trial was both liberating and exhausting. On one hand, she felt a profound sense of relief knowing that Hayes and Cole would never wear badges again. Their prison sentences, 5 years each, were a small measure of justice, but they symbolized something much larger: the possibility of change. On the other hand, the emotional toll of reliving her trauma over and over again had left its mark. She struggled with sleepless nights, intrusive thoughts, and moments of crippling anxiety. Yet, despite these challenges, Michelle refused to let herself retreat into silence. If anything, the trial had strengthened her resolve to keep fighting. Marcus played a pivotal role in helping Michelle navigate the whirlwind of attention and responsibility that followed the verdict. He encouraged her to use her platform wisely, reminding her that her voice could inspire others to demand better from their leaders. Together, they began brainstorming ways to channel the momentum of the case into meaningful action. They reached out to civil rights lawyers, community organizers, and policy experts, forming a coalition dedicated to reforming policing practices across the country. One of the first initiatives Michelle championed was a push for mandatory body cameras for all law enforcement officers. During the trial, body cam footage had proven invaluable in corroborating witness testimonies and exposing inconsistencies in Hayes and Cole's accounts. Michelle argued that equipping every officer with a camera would increase transparency and hold them accountable for their actions. Her campaign quickly gained traction, earning endorsements from prominent figures in politics, entertainment, and activism. Within months, several states introduced legislation requiring body cameras for police officers, a direct result of Michelle's advocacy. Another area Michelle focused on was addressing the lack of oversight within internal affairs departments. One of the most damning revelations during the trial was how complaints against Hayes and Cole had been ignored or buried by higher-ups. This pattern of negligence wasn't unique to Chicago. Similar stories existed in cities nationwide. To combat this issue, Michelle worked with lawmakers to draft bills that would establish independent review boards to investigate allegations of misconduct. These boards would operate outside the control of local police departments, ensuring impartiality and fairness. While some officials resisted the idea, citing concerns about cost and logistics, public pressure eventually forced them to reconsider. Michelle also became a vocal advocate for diversity training within law enforcement agencies. She believed that many officers harbored unconscious biases that influenced their interactions with marginalized communities. By implementing comprehensive training programs, departments could foster greater empathy and understanding among their ranks. Michelle partnered with psychologists and educators to develop workshops that combined classroom instruction with real-world scenarios. Early results showed promising improvements in officer behavior, reinforcing the importance of such initiatives. Despite her growing influence, Michelle remained grounded in her roots. She continued teaching at her school, using her classroom as a space to educate young minds about social justice and civic responsibility. Her students admired her courage and often asked questions about her experience. Instead of shying away from these conversations, Michelle embraced them, turning difficult topics into teachable moments. "I want you to know that your voices matter," she told her class one day. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step forward counts." Outside of work, Michelle leaned heavily on her support network. Marcus remained her closest ally, offering guidance and encouragement whenever she needed it. Friends and family rallied around her, ensuring she didn't shoulder the burden alone. Even strangers who had followed her story reached out, sending letters of gratitude and solidarity. Their messages reminded Michelle that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for millions of people who shared her pain and hoped for a brighter future. Meanwhile, the fallout from Hayes and Cole's conviction rippled through the police department. Internal investigations were launched to identify other officers with histories of misconduct. Several high-ranking officials resigned amid accusations of covering up past abuses. Public trust in the department plummeted, prompting city leaders to implement sweeping reforms. New policies were introduced to improve hiring practices, enhance community engagement, and strengthen disciplinary procedures. While critics argued that these changes were too little, too late, supporters praised them as a step in the right direction. For Hayes and Cole, life behind bars was harsh and unforgiving. Stripped of their authority and status, they found themselves ostracized even by fellow inmates. Rumors circulated that they had received threats from other prisoners angered by their crimes. In interviews conducted by journalists, both men expressed regret. But whether it was genuine remorse or an attempt to salvage their reputations remained unclear. Regardless, Their downfall served as a stark reminder that no one was above the law. As weeks turned into months, Michelle reflected on how far she had come since that fateful night. What began as a terrifying encounter had transformed into a catalyst for change. She had faced unimaginable fear, endured public scrutiny, and channeled her pain into purpose. Along the way, she had inspired countless individuals to join the fight for racial justice. But Michelle knew the journey was far from over. Systemic racism was deeply entrenched, and dismantling it would require sustained effort and unwavering determination. In interviews, Michelle often acknowledged that her work was just beginning. "We've made progress, yes," she said during one appearance on a national talk show. "But there are still so many barriers to break down, so many people who feel invisible, unheard, and unprotected. My goal is to make sure they know they're not alone, and that together, we can create a world where everyone feels safe and valued." Her words resonated with audiences across the globe. People saw in Michelle not just a survivor, but a leader, a beacon of hope in a world desperate for change. As she stood on stage accepting awards, giving speeches, and meeting with policymakers, Michelle carried with her the memories of that night, not as a source of bitterness, but as a reminder of why she fought so hard. And though the scars might never fully heal, she wore them proudly, as symbols of resilience, courage, and the power of speaking truth to power. The months following the trial became a turning point not just for Michelle Anderson, but for communities across the country. What had started as a personal nightmare had evolved into a movement, a call to action that resonated far beyond the streets of Chicago. Michelle's courage and determination inspired people from all walks of life to join her in demanding accountability, transparency, and justice. Her story wasn't just about one woman standing up to systemic racism. It was about rewriting the rules of a broken system. Michelle's advocacy work grew exponentially as she leaned into her newfound role as a leader in the fight against police brutality. She founded an organization called Voices for Justice, dedicated to addressing racial disparities within law enforcement and promoting equitable policies. The group brought together activists, lawyers, educators, and community members who shared a common goal: creating safer, fairer neighborhoods for everyone. Through workshops, town hall meetings, and grassroots campaigns, Voices for Justice quickly gained momentum, becoming a powerful force for change. One of Michelle's first major initiatives with the organization was launching a nationwide petition to reform qualified immunity laws. Qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that often shielded officers from being sued for misconduct, had long been criticized as a barrier to holding police accountable. Michelle argued passionately that ending this protection would empower citizens to seek justice when harmed by law enforcement. "If we want real accountability," she told a packed auditorium during a speech, "we need to remove the shields that protect bad actors. No one should be above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it." The petition garnered millions of signatures, drawing attention from lawmakers at both state and federal levels. Several legislators introduced bills aimed at revising or abolishing qualified immunity, citing Michelle's efforts as a catalyst for legislative action. Though progress was slow and met with resistance from powerful lobbying groups, the growing public outcry made it clear that the tide was shifting. For the first time in decades, meaningful discussions about policing reform were taking place in Congress, and Michelle's voice was at the center of it all. In addition to policy changes, Michelle focused on fostering dialogue between law enforcement, agencies, and the communities they served. She believed that building trust required more than just new laws. It demanded open communication and mutual understanding. To achieve this, she organized community policing forums where residents could share their concerns directly with officers. These events weren't always easy. Tensions ran high and emotions often spilled over. But through honest conversations and shared experiences, bridges began to form. Officers listened to stories of fear and frustration, while community members learned about the challenges faced by those in uniform. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Michelle also prioritized empowering young people to become agents of change. As a teacher, she understood the importance of education in shaping future generations. She developed curriculum, modules designed to teach students about civil rights, civic engagement, and the power of activism. Her lessons emphasized critical thinking and encouraged students to question systems of inequality. "You are the leaders of tomorrow," she often told her classes. "Don't wait for someone else to fix what's broken. Be the ones to do it." Her efforts extended beyond the classroom. Michelle partnered with youth organizations to host leadership camps focused on social justice. Participants learned how to organize protests, draft petitions, and engage with elected officials effectively. Many of these young advocates went on to lead initiatives in their own communities, proving that Michelle's message was spreading far and wide. One such student, a 17-year-old named Jasmine, started a campaign to install memorials honoring victims of police violence in her hometown. When asked about her inspiration, Jasmine simply replied, "Michelle taught me that silence is complicity. I want to make sure no one forgets the lives lost to injustice." As Michelle's influence grew, so did the recognition she received. Awards poured in from organizations around the world, celebrating her bravery and commitment to equality. She was invited to speak at international conferences, universities, and government summits, sharing her story with audiences eager to learn from her journey. Despite the accolades, Michelle remained humble, always redirecting praise to the countless individuals who supported her along the way. "This isn't my victory," she would say. "It belongs to everyone who has stood up, spoken out, and refused to stay silent." But Michelle's road wasn't without obstacles. Critics accused her of exaggerating the problem of police misconduct, claiming that most officers were honorable and hardworking. Others dismissed her efforts as ineffective, arguing that systemic racism couldn't be dismantled overnight. While these comments stung, Michelle refused to let them derail her mission. Instead, she used them as fuel to push harder. "Change doesn't happen because it's easy," she said during an interview. "It happens because we refuse to give up, even when it feels impossible." Despite the challenges, Michelle found strength in the connections she forged. She built friendships with fellow activists, learning from their experiences and collaborating on projects. She leaned on Marcus, whose unwavering support kept her grounded during moments of doubt. And she drew inspiration from the everyday heroes she encountered: mothers organizing marches, fathers teaching their children about equality, and survivors finding the courage to share their stories. Together, they formed a tapestry of resilience, each thread contributing to a larger picture of hope. Years passed, and Michelle's impact continued to ripple outward. Cities implemented reforms inspired by her advocacy, including stricter oversight boards, de-escalation training programs, and mental health resources for officers. Police departments adopted policies requiring body cameras and banning chokeholds. While there was still much work to be done, the progress was undeniable. Communities once divided by mistrust began to heal, inch by inch. On the 5th anniversary of her traffic stop, Michelle stood on stage at a national conference, reflecting on how far she had come. The audience erupted in applause as she recounted her journey, from the terrifying night that changed her life to the global movement she helped ignite. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, not from fear, but from emotion. "I never imagined I'd be here today," she admitted. "When that officer pointed his gun at me, I thought my story might end right there, but instead it became a beginning, a chance to fight for something bigger than myself." She paused, scanning the sea of faces before her. Some were familiar, others strangers, but all united by a shared vision of justice. "We've accomplished so much," she continued, "but our work isn't finished. Racism doesn't disappear overnight, and neither does fear. But every step we take brings us closer to a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued. So let's keep going. Let's keep fighting. Because together, we can create a future worth believing in." As Michelle stepped off the stage, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The scars of that night remained etched in her memory, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they served as reminders of her strength, her resilience, and her purpose. She knew the fight for justice would continue long after she was gone, But for now, she was proud to play her part. Michelle's legacy wasn't just in the policies she helped shape or the movements she inspired. It was in the hearts and minds of the people she touched, the countless individuals who saw themselves in her story and realized they too could make a difference. In a world often clouded by despair, Michelle Anderson stood as a beacon of hope, proving that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through. And as long as there were voices willing to speak truth to power, that light would never fade.